Dominic Armantrout here, doing my mutual funds project for my Finance 451 investments class. What I'll be doing today is comparing two funds, essentially, for three different categories, each category being domestic funds, international funds, and sector funds. So I'll be comparing a fund that I like and a fund that I don't like. I'm looking at four main things here. The expense ratio, because if these funds are paying high expense ratios, they aren't paying out to the investor well. Turnover ratio, because I want to see exactly how many times they're turning over that portfolio, and if they're doing it high, if they're effectively turning over that portfolio and picking proper investments. I'll be looking at 5-year performance, because I personally like to pick investments that I can essentially bank on for the long term as opposed to short-term investing. And in management, I want to see how long they've been with the fund, and if they've been there a long time, if they've been able to successfully manage those funds. So for domestic funds, I chose the Aberdeen Focused U.S. Equity Fund and the Vanguard U.S. Growth Admiral Fund. So in comparison here, the expense ratios, the Aberdeen is definitely higher, while maybe not that high as compared to other funds. But in this domestic in the domestic market, it is definitely higher than this Vanguard fund. So they're not going to be paying as much to investors as this Vanguard fund is going to. Turnover, they're pretty similar. However, the Aberdeen is higher. So when we're taking a look at these performances over the long term, essentially these turnover ratios, the Aberdeen is maybe being actively managed a little more, while as this Vanguard fund maybe is comfortable with some of the performance and some of the pickings they've already done. They're both positive performances in the past 5 years. However, this Vanguard is definitely better at 13.28%, while this Aberdeen is only at 4.35%. Comparing with managers, though, the Aberdeen only has 3 managers. The time range is from 10 years to 14 years, so that they've all been there for a fairly long time. All but one are a CFA, so they have that CFA certification. However, when you take a look at this Vanguard, they have 11 managers actively managing this fund. The time ranges from 3 years to 8 years, so while they have been there a shorter amount of time, it looks like they are actively managing a little bit better with that 13.28% 5-year performance. And the same thing, all but one are CFA certified. So I went ahead and compared the two over the 5-year. And as you can see here, this Vanguard, it has just outperformed very well over this Aberdeen within the past 5 years. So for me, that's just a much better choice for this long-term investment. So I definitely would go with this Vanguard over this Aberdeen for domestic. For my international funds, I chose a Fidelity Advisor Latin America Fund and a Wasatch Emerging Indian Fund. These expense ratios are both actually fairly high. This Fidelity one is higher, though, at 2.14%, while this Emerging India Fund is at 1.73%. This Fidelity one, however, is at 51% turnover, which means that compared to the 17% of the Emerging India Fund, the Fidelity one might be actively managed more, but that could mean that this Emerging India Fund is just more comfortable with what they have. And as you can see over the past 5 years, the performance, this Emerging India Fund has very well outperformed. It's in the positive 15.7%, while this Fidelity is in the negative 6.02%. They only have one manager on this Fidelity Latin America Fund, and they've been with the fund for 3 years, whereas this Emerging India Fund has 2 managers. Both are CFA certified. They both have CFA certification. This Fidelity does not have a CFA certification. And one has been with the fund for 2 years, only 2 years, but this other one has been with the fund for 7 years. So getting that fresh pair of eyes in there to probably help out the person who's been with the fund a little bit longer. And looking at this 5-year performance comparison, they have just completely blown the Emerging India Fund's blown this Fidelity Fund out of the water in the past 5 years performance-wise. I believe the Fidelity actually has a back-end load. Yes, the Fidelity actually has a back-end load as well. So we know that there's nothing saying that load funds actually outperform no load funds. So inevitably, I'm going to go with this emerging India fund because it's outperforming in the past 5 years. Its turnover ratio is less, but they're successfully performing that with picking what they're picking. Both these managers have the certification, which is definitely helpful, and there's no cost for me as an investor on the back end or for any instance. So for the sector fund, I chose the Mainstay Cushing Energy Income and Fidelity Select Semiconductors. These are both in different sectors because I wanted to get a more diversified look at things here. So taking a look at these funds, like I said, they're in different sectors. The Fidelity is in the technology sector, and the Mainstay Cushing is in the equity energy sector. Taking a look at these expense ratios, the Mainstay is very high at 2.32% expense ratio, and the expense ratio for this Fidelity is very low at 0.75%. So I would be getting more payouts from this Fidelity just based on the fact that they're not spending as much money as opposed to this Mainstay. The Mainstay turnover ratio, however, is at 51%, and this Fidelity is at 110%. So inevitably, what I'm looking for with this high turnover ratio for Fidelity is the fact that they are actively managing it, and it appears that they're actively managing it well with this 5-year performance. So with this small turnover ratio, or the smaller turnover ratio for Mainstay, their performance is sitting at, for 5 years, is at negative 20.44% as compared to the Fidelity's plus 20.31%. So they're not necessarily actively managing it as well as this Fidelity is. The crazy thing about this is this Mainstay has 3 managers. 1 out of the 3 is CFA certified. Their years range from 2 years to 6 years, but they're not performing nowhere near as well as this one manager that's been with this fund for 10 years for the Fidelity, who is not CFA certified. And if we take a look at their performance comparison in the past 5 years, we can clearly see that this Fidelity is way outperforming this Mainstay fund, and it's just doing a well job with performing. And this Mainstay actually, I also believe, has a back end load. It does. So by not paying that back end load on this Fidelity is definitely more appealing. So I just chose, like I said, the expense ratios, look at the turnover ratios, 5-year performance, and the managers. I thought those were the most important because taking a look at these, I could pretty much gauge and determine where this performance is going for the long term, how well they've been performing it in the past, and what they're doing with this turnover, and how they're actually spending this money, if they're paying out the investors or if they're putting it into the fund and not paying their investors. So yes, yeah.